Welcome. This is another in our series of videos on Robbins Socio-Rhetorical criticism. Today we will be looking at his intertexture. This is a part of video series for Greek Exegesis by Susan Hares. Now I want to remind you where intertexture fits inside of Robbins Socio-Rhetorical diagram. Robbins looks at the diagram with saying there's an implied author, an implied reader. It gives verbal signs to the rest of the world, and it represents the world. This may not be the same as the real world or the world that we have today. The real world that it was written in was the Mediterranean world, and our world stands beyond that as an American or a European or an Asian world. Now, inside that word, there's an implied author, and he writes a text, and you can see repetition, you can see stories in the text. Beyond that text, and what points to it, is an intertexture, history, culture. That's what we'll look at right now. That influences the verbal signs that are given, and it influences how the narrators or the characters in these stories occur. Let's begin with that. Remember that as Robbin looks at his texture, he thinks of an intertexture that every reading has a subtext, and an intertexture that every comparison has boundaries, and social that every meaning has a context, and ideology textures that every theology has politics. So Robbin's intertexture has four parts: oral-scribal, cultural, social, and historical. So let's sort of give a short summary of it. The oral-scribal has recitation, contextualization, and reconfiguration of text. The cultural looks at reference or echoes of culture. Social looks at practices and conventions of people in social situations, and historical looks at historical backgrounds. These I've mapped to the lab exegetical work. You notice that in some cases he's just echoing lad, like in the historic or the oral-scribal. Some he's expanding the cultural and social part that you'd expect. So let's look at oral-scribal. What is it? Oral-scribal is the way the text is created from metaphor, images, symbolic world of an early text to reference and echoes of early scripture. Recitation is the presentation of a speech, narrative, or an other oral written form in exact words or different phrases. A Sharia will say, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone." That occurs in Luke 4:4. It's a Sharia of Jesus giving a recitation from Deuteronomy 8:3. Now, there's a Sharia with a narrative in its own word in Mark 2:25 through 26. I encourage you to read all of it, but it begins, "Have you never read what David did when he and the ones who were with him were hungry?" Take a look at that text and notice that Jesus is restating it in his own words. Now, recontextualization presents words from a biblical text without mentioning that the verbs are written. 1 Peter 2:3 recontextualizes Psalm 34:8. Like newborn babes, long for pure spiritual milk. Now, then you have reconfiguration, which restructures earlier tradition and simply presents it. If you read Acts 7:30 through 32, you find that Stephen, in his speech before the Sanhedrin, is giving the past ideas of Moses. He's giving a summary. It shows that he's learned, he's understood, he's a rabbinical teacher. They said the very basics of a rabbinical were to be able to recount the story. The second is to be able to answer questions. The third is to present an argument where you can give a recitation like this. And Stephen is demonstrating his skill. Luke 4:1 also configures the story of Moses, and this is Luke writing it as a story, showing the same skill. Where in Exodus, he had no bread or water for 40 days. He combines that with Elijah's flight into the wilderness to use the same terminology to describe Jesus' baptism and his testing in the wilderness for 40 days. This would naturally bring that into understanding in the Jewish mind or those familiar with the scriptures. Now, cultural intertexture. That's the way a new text is created from references or culture, echoes of a culture. You can give a reference to a word, a phrase, or a clause that refers to a position or tradition known by a people. In Mark, it is Elijah's a reference to the greatest prophets. Even today in the Passover ceremony, you may have Elijah's chair for when Elijah comes to foretell the Messiah. Now there's an echo when a word or phrase evokes a potential cultural tradition. 1 Thessalonians 2, which we've studied, evokes a lecture of Theocristums who describing four types of cynic philosophers. The best way that people understood Paul and the other apostles was that they were cynics, they were philosophers, giving lectures and teaching people. Paul's ability to then understand that's how they viewed them and evoke that cultural intertexture shows his ability to connect to those in the Greco-Roman culture, or the Greek-Roman culture. Now, what about a social intertexture? What is it? It's a way that a text is created from the concepts of social interaction at the time. There are many concepts to consider: honor, shame, patronage, client, paterfamilia, extended, that is, as you've seen in other videos, extended families run by male heads of family. Or even at the same time, Lydia, who was a specific exception given to women who'd raised families by Augustus. You see, the paterfamilia is this household concept where everyone moves in the same place. The table fellowship restrictions. Who can be a fellow of yours at the table? Who can share? And then the concept of didos, one's own meals, ones you brought with you, like bringing a pot of food to a potluck but not sharing it, or a common meal is shared foods at a potluck. Well, then there's historical. What is it? Experiences at a particular time at a particular place in history set the stage within the story, which then is set within the larger Mediterranean world, which is not our world. Our world is an American or Asian. In other words, if you're in the Mediterranean, you probably understand the biblical context, because the Mediterranean world still has a particular concept, even though it was far removed from you 2,000 years in time. It still has some of the same cultural, historical pieces. Now, what about historical? We've given tremendous amounts of historical information to help you dig into the very background of it historically. For example, Jewish experiences in the Second Temple period after the Maccabees Revolution and before the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD were dramatically different than after 70 AD. Understanding that these letters were written before the destruction of the temple is important. The Jewish experiences in Diaspora in Thessalonica and Corinth were vastly different than the Jewish experience in a large settlement like Alexandria, Antioch, or Rome. Understanding those historical contexts will give you the view of what was supposed to be written. Well, I hope that if you have questions on this or any other formal methods, you will contact me, email or contact me via my Facebook. There are also Robbins Socio-Historical Criticism and a Social Cultural Intertexture, which is different than that within the world, and we will cover that next. Thank you for attending this, and I look forward to speaking with you again on our next video.